Hello and good evening to anyone who's joining us here for this modality partnership, Be Winter Ready, Nutrition and Lifestyle Top Tips. My name's Josh Brocklebank. I am a practice pharmacist working in the surgeries in AWC modality around Yorkshire, and I'm joined by two very expert GP who are going to be joining us through and helping us through the information this evening. I hope everyone is out there keeping nice and warm. It is freezing here in my house, so I hope everyone is nice and warm at home. But I will be passing us over to Dr. Bhardwaj very shortly. Just to let you know, please feel free to send any questions through as we go through the presentation. We will be coming back to them at the end, and we'll have both Dr. Ratcliffe's and Dr. Bhardwaj, as well as also mine, input on those questions when we get to them. But I will now hand you over to Dr. Bhardwaj for the presentation.
Thank you, Josh, and good evening, YouTube, and good evening, Facebook. And those are words that I never expected to be uttering in my medical career. So I'm actually going to share my screen initially, and hopefully Josh and Tom, you can just tell me that that's happening successfully.
Yep, it's all up there, Vipan. Off you go.
Thank you very much. Okay, so a really warm welcome to all of you. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to work with you, hopefully to keep you in good health over the course of the winter, a time of year which can be problematic for many of us. What we hope to do is to keep you nice and well, so that there's sort of no risk of ending up in hospital. So my name is Vipan Bhardwaj. I'm a GP partner in Wokingham, and it was actually just earlier this week, I think, that Wokingham was declared the third happiest place in England by one of the estate agency companies, I believe. Anyway, completely irrelevant. But my colleague that's joining me tonight is Dr. Tom Ratcliffe, who's a GP in Keighley in Yorkshire. And as you can see from the slide, Dr. Ratcliffe leads Modality's digital transformation team, and it's him and his team that have been responsible for a lot of the background work that's actually gone into this session and to this program more widely. One of my roles is that I am Modality Partnership's National Lifestyle Medicine Clinical Director. Lifestyle medicine is not a term that I'm particularly happy with, but I have to get over it because it's actually an accepted speciality within medicine. What is lifestyle medicine? Well, it's really doing the basics, doing the fundamentals, and hopefully therefore not relying excessively on medication. What those fundamentals, what those basics are, will become hopefully apparent during the course of this evening's session. You can also see at the top of the slide, it says declarations of interest. What does that mean? Well, it means that Dr. Ratcliffe and I have no financial conflicts of interest. A program like this, as will become apparent, hopefully gets no sort of drug company funding. We're not here peddling any books or flogging you any kind of funky vitamins or supplements. We are full-time NHS GPs, and that's it. So this is what we'll cover during the session. It'll last about an hour. The presentation itself is about 20 minutes, which will then hopefully leave us plenty of time for questions, and Dr. Ratcliffe and I will answer your questions. So we'll start with an introduction into why this is an important topic for us to be discussing, why it is that we've dedicated a session and indeed an entire program to it. And we'll explain that those living with diabetes and high blood pressure and this thing that we'll come to called the metabolic syndrome are at greater risk of poor health over winter. We'll go through some science, nothing hopefully too scary, but enough to give you some insight into why it is that the diabetics and those with high blood pressure have that additional risk and how this program helps. We'll outline that there are some lifestyle changes, that term again, that will probably help far more than medication. Dr. Ratcliffe and I may perhaps be slightly unusual in that actually we'd prefer not to put you on extra pills, but hopefully tackle sort of ill health through lifestyle changes. And then we'll round things off by introducing you to the Health and Wellbeing app that you are able to access as Patients and Modality Partnership, and also through the app to a group of people that you may be unfamiliar with called Health and Wellbeing Coaches. More about the app and the coaches a little bit later. So we'll get cracking. This, to some extent, is a summary slide of the entire session. This is a paramedic standing in front of an ambulance. And I think most of us would agree that we would prefer not to end up in hospital. And we'd certainly prefer not to be carted off to hospital by a paramedic. In the nicest possible way, we would prefer never to have to meet one of these chaps. And that's really what tonight's session and the program more generally is all about: keeping you well during the course of the winter and hopefully beyond, hopefully so well that you don't need to end up in hospital. Now, most of you present tonight will have received an individual invite because you have diabetes or high blood pressure. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, high blood pressure, the medical term for high blood pressure is hypertension. So you will see high blood pressure and hypertension used relatively interchangeably during the course of the night. Diabetics and those with high blood pressure are at extra risk of needing this chap's services. Now, there will be some of you who have not received an individual invite. You're here because we have publicized this session and this program on your practice's Facebook page or website. You're exceedingly welcome, and you're actually very welcome to join the program if you would like that sort of extra support. There is an email and a phone number on the landing page from which you access tonight's session. You just need to contact us, and then we can take it from there. So we're going to start with some data, and with due apologies for those of you who have an allergy to graphs, be reassured that this is the only one. So the starting point is that this slide is the product of a 10-year analysis of 220,000 modality patients' clinical records. I'll just say that again. 220,000 modality patients' records have been analysed going back over a period of 10 years. So what are we looking at? We are looking at a graph showing us who is at risk. At risk of what? Well, as already mentioned, at risk of getting poorly over winter and then ending up in A&E, or worse, perhaps being hospitalized. So along the bottom, we have combinations of what we call long-term conditions. As the name suggests, these are medical conditions that people live with over the long term as opposed to short term. And this, as you can see, these are combinations of 3 conditions. We have similar sort of graphs for combinations of 2 conditions, and the numbers are very similar. On this side, we have the actual numbers of patients living with those conditions who have been identified at risk. And when I first saw this slide, the first sort of version of this slide was a few months ago, I kind of fell off my chair because what this told us in no uncertain terms was that those who have the maximum risk, the most vulnerable patients to getting poorly in winter, so poorly that they might need to end up in A&E or being admitted to hospital, are those that have diabetes and hypertension, high blood pressure. And as you can see, all along the graph, we have diabetes and hypertension, diabetes and hypertension, diabetes and hypertension, hypertension, diabetes, and so on and so on. And then just for full clarity, some of the other conditions, I'll just explain what they are. CKD is an abbreviation for chronic kidney disease. CHD, coronary heart disease. Asthma, CKD. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That's smoking-related lung damage. HF is heart failure. And over here we have stroke. Now, if I tell you that the number one cause of CKD, chronic kidney disease, is diabetes, you can see just how important diabetes in particular, in amongst these kind of conditions, diabetes is very, very important. And remember, this is a 10-year analysis of 220,000 patients. This graph is telling us something incredibly important, profoundly important. What that something is, I'm just going to keep you in suspense just for a couple of slides longer and come back to in a bit. And you can see at the bottom here, there's a phrase here, metabolic conditions, and that may be something that you're unfamiliar with. Some of you may not have heard. Well, there's a collection of things called metabolic syndrome. So those things, there are 4 of them. You've got one example here, this fine fellow over here carrying a little bit too much weight around his tummy, so being a little bit overweight. Lipid problems, in other words, blood fats. Interestingly, cholesterol by itself is not that important. Hypertension, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Any 3 out of those 4 equals metabolic syndrome. But connected are things that you may be slightly unfamiliar with and maybe slightly surprising. Dementia. Well, to this day, some people still refer to dementia as type 3 diabetes because there is a correlation between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. Cancer, it's been known about for decades that a major risk factor for cancer is carrying a bit too much weight around the belly. So the metabolic syndrome more widely is incredibly important and again is telling us something that we'll come to in just a bit. So I promised you a little bit of science, nothing too scary. And it's worth just reflecting that nothing on this slide is remotely controversial. This is very, very mainstream science, so mainstream that actually it's in most school science textbooks. It's been known about for decades and decades. Everything that happens in our bodies, absolutely everything, is as a result of our hormones. And metabolic syndrome, that combination of diabetes, high blood pressure, abnormal fats, and being overweight, is essentially a product of 2 hormones that are on this slide. And you can see insulin. We'll start with insulin. Now, insulin's main job is to store fat. It takes glucose, which we often refer to as blood sugar, it sweeps it out of the bloodstream and it sort of shoves it into our cells. And inside our cells, the glucose is turned into fat. The higher the insulin level, the more the fat is being stored. Now, straight away, I think most of us would say that doesn't sound that great. Anything that is promoting the storage of fat, that doesn't seem like something we want to particularly encourage. It's actually, unfortunately, even worse than that, because as you can see here, what insulin also does is at the kidneys, it encourages the retention of salt. And when our bodies are retaining salt, our blood pressure is going up. So in addition to high levels of insulin causing high levels of fat storage, actually we have high levels of salt retention and high blood pressure, in addition to worse diabetes. So if we then sort of think about this and we think, well, what might be promoting those high levels of insulin? Well, that'll be our diets, and particularly the carbohydrate and starch content of our diets. And you can see some examples here, sort of things that we're kind of familiar with: rice and pasta and noodles and bread and potatoes, fruit, not to mention sort of cakes and pastries and biscuits, etc., etc. So in my own head, when I sort of think about a carbohydrate or a starch, I visualize, let's say, 1,000 Lego blocks. So one Lego block is a single glucose or a single blood sugar. You shove 1,000 of those together, 1,000 glucoses or 1,000 Lego blocks, and that is a starch. We eat starch or carbohydrate, and once it gets into our body, it gets broken down. Those 1,000 Lego blocks get broken down into individual Lego blocks or individual glucoses or blood sugars. The effect is that those insulin levels go up. On the other side, we've got cortisol, which is less related to diet and more related to, as you can see on here, the other things, the sleep, the stress, exercise. And what cortisol is often referred to as a stress hormone. So if we're not sleeping very well, if we're stressed, anxious, unhappy, then our cortisol levels go up. And what does cortisol do? It actually increases the glucose in our blood. It increases the blood sugar, which of course then increases the insulin. And then we've got a vicious circle. In a way, this slide is almost a summary of our modern sort of lifestyles. People perhaps eating more carbohydrate than they really should be, and at the same time, not perhaps particularly happy, not sleeping very well, not exercising, not spending enough time outside, etc. And when you then put all of that together, it's little wonder that we've really got a major public health crisis on our hands. Since the 1960s, diabetes rates have increased 12-fold and are expected to almost double over just the next 6 years. And we have around about 2/3 of the English adult population who are either overweight or obese. Now, some of you may have joined one of our previous Facebook Live sessions, which was entitled Heart Disease, Know Your Numbers, and you may have seen these numbers, albeit in a slightly different format. If you haven't watched that and you're curious, it's there on our YouTube channel. You're very welcome to it. I won't go into these numbers in sort of exquisite detail because sometimes a sort of a blizzard of numbers can be a little off-putting. But suffice to say, if you're a diabetic, we want your HbA1c to be as low as possible. For those that need a little reminder, the HbA1c is how we measure the control of diabetes. It's how we diagnose diabetes, but also how we measure control. So the lower the number, if your HbA1c can be under 40, fantastic. 40 to 47 is what we call pre-diabetes range. The NHS actually counts up to 58 as good control, okay control. Above that, not so good. And then you can see some sort of blood pressure targets here and also sort of weight targets. What might count as a healthy weight that sort of keeps you in good shape. Okay, staying well this winter, but without more pills. Now, why is that last bit? Why is that important? Well, the reason is actually incredibly simple and perhaps maybe slightly surprising. So on the previous slide, you saw some of the numbers that are good numbers to have, an HbA1c as low as possible, blood pressure, etc. But how those numbers are achieved is actually more important in a way than the numbers themselves. So what I mean by that is that if you, let's say we take an HbA1c of 45, having that HbA1c of 45 through medication is less beneficial for our health than getting it through lifestyle changes, the sort of thing that you can see summarized on this slide, what I call the basics and the fundamentals. And that takes a bit of getting your head around. And so I'll just say that again, the HbA1c, how an HbA1c or a blood pressure or weight, how that's arrived at is incredibly important because it tells us how good our health is likely to be and how high or low our risk of ill health is likely to be. And that's because of a word that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is inflammation. And that's the message that the graph was telling us that I sort of teased a little bit earlier on. So what we know, what we're increasingly becoming aware of, is that diabetics and those with metabolic syndrome more widely have consistently high levels of inflammation in our bodies. And that's okay as long as we're okay. We're basically walking a bit of a tightrope. What then happens potentially in wintertime is that we get an infection, maybe a flu-like illness or a diarrhea and vomiting bug, and that tightrope, walking that tightrope, we basically fall off. The balance is completely upset. Those inflammation levels rise, and we end up poorly and potentially ending up in A&E or being taken to hospital. And that's almost certainly why diabetics and hypertensives and those with metabolic syndrome generally are at much greater risk of ending up in hospital. So that's the sort of the background and the science. And now really over the course of the next few slides, there is the sort of the more practical stuff. This is how hopefully you're going to keep in decent shape, in good health this winter, but not just every winter, not just this winter, but every winter to come. Now, we've entitled this 8 Lifestyle Factors. There are various other permutations. You can look online and you can see some people talk about 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. They're generally versions of the same kind of advice. Now, all of this stuff that I'm going to cover, I won't be able to go into in great detail because frankly, people have written entire textbooks about this, but a summary of this with lots more information is all in the app. And the health coaches will be able to help as well. Again, I'm going to come to that in a little bit. So having talked about carbohydrates and insulin, it should not come as a surprise that the dietary approach that we advocate is one that is lower in carbohydrates, somewhere around about 100, 120 grams per day. We also suggest that there's no need to weigh and to count and to measure. The way that we've actually structured this makes it really easy to follow so that there's no need to actually count anything. Many of us will be eating way too many carbohydrates, and healthy for us, especially for those living with diabetes and high blood pressure. And a simple reduction to around 100, 120 will be enormously beneficial. Now, what's perhaps not so well understood, but we know, people like myself have been running programs like this since about 2016, is that when carbohydrate levels come down, hunger also comes down. And so we often say that an eating program like this is actually substantially cheaper than a sort of a standard English kind of diet. So it's perfectly possible, and indeed most people will find that they won't need to have 3 meals a day plus snacks. A couple of meals a day will be absolutely fine. So missing a meal, either breakfast or whatever suits your lifestyle, will be perfectly possible. And that actually does wonders to those insulin levels. If you can go, let's say, from an evening meal to lunchtime, let's say the next day without eating, those insulin levels are kept even lower, which of course is exactly what we want to do. Having seen the previous few slides, you may be starting to become aware that maintaining a healthy weight is actually less about calories and more about, you guessed it, hormones, in particular insulin. And of course, insulin responds very much to the carbohydrate content of our diet. So if we reduce the carbohydrate content, the insulin levels are going to come down, and that means fat storage is going to be reduced. Blood pressure will come down because the amount of salt that's being retained in the kidneys is going to come down. And it really, for most people, is as simple as that. Now, we've also mentioned a couple of other hormones on here, serotonin and dopamine. People may be familiar with those. They're often referred to as the feel-good hormones. So they're the things that if you have a big chunk of Christmas cake, for instance, those hormones will rocket and you'll feel great. But of course, unfortunately, as soon as the insulin has done its thing and swept all of that glucose out into the cells, those levels fall and we have the so-called crash. So serotonin and dopamine, there are better ways to keep those high that don't involve sort of high sugar, high carbohydrate food. I'm going to come to exercise in just a little bit. Alcohol, probably worth keeping it in quite significant moderation, or maybe not at all. Alcohol isn't great for our stress hormones. It's also not great for sleep. Beer, often referred to as liquid bread, because it's pretty high in carbohydrates, and also nutritionally, there's very little of any sort of great nutritional value in beer in particular. I don't really need to labour the point about smoking. We've known since the 1950s that smoking causes lung cancer. It also causes other cancers, heart disease. There's very little good that comes out of smoking. Exercise, massively important, but perhaps not in the way that people sometimes think. Exercise for weight loss is actually not that important. What exercise does do, on the other hand, is it does wonderful things to our hormones. And as a result, diabetes control can be improved, blood pressure can be improved. On this slide, by the way, CV stands for cardiovascular. Cardiovascular means heart and stroke. The single most important exercise that most of us can do is to walk. NHS guidance is to walk for about 150 minutes per week, 2.5 hours. If you can, to chunk that down to 3 lots of 50 minutes if possible. But if that's difficult to do because of lifestyle, work, family, etc., then, as it says on this slide, 20 to 30 minutes, sort of 6 times a day, 6 times a week, for instance, that'll do the job. Not quite as well, but better than doing nothing. But the pace of that walking is actually quite important. So we're not talking about sprinting. We're also not talking about sort of dawdling. We're talking about a pace where you can just about sustain a conversation. You can have a conversation with somebody, but to be honest, you'd probably rather not. Any more than that, if you went a bit quicker or you started going uphill, you'd actually properly get out of puff. That pace is important because some very, very interesting and beneficial hormonal changes occur in our cells. Strength training is really important. As we get older, we lose muscle and we're more likely to fall. So for those of you, for instance, who maybe already go to the gym and do some weight training, that's perfect, carry on. But for anybody who is maybe coming back to exercise after a period off, or maybe hasn't really ever exercised, then we've put together what we call a 3 to 5 exercise plan. Now, this is quite difficult to sort of demonstrate on a call like this. So we're in the process of actually sorting out a video and then putting that into the app. But there's a range, as you can see on here, 3 to 5 exercises, 3 to 5 repetitions, 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 days of the week. Why is there a range? Because you may go through a week where you're absolutely feeling brilliant, in which case you can do 5 exercises, 5 repetitions, 5 sets, 5 days of the week. But maybe the following week you're actually not firing on all cylinders. Well, don't do nothing, but do 3 exercises, 3 repetitions, 3 sets, maybe 3 days a week, or somewhere in between. That's why there's that sort of range. Stress, short word, often misunderstood, but to a clinician, a GP like myself, stress means, you guessed it, hormones. We've already talked about cortisol as a stress hormone. So all of the things on the right-hand side of this slide will help cortisol levels to come down, which of course means that blood sugar levels keep low, insulin levels keep low. And in the context of what we're talking about tonight, means that diabetes is better controlled, high blood pressure is better controlled, and the risk of ending up in hospital is lower. Previous slide was talking about walking. Walking in the woods is even better. The Japanese call that Shinrin Yoku. And what is amazing, and again, I remember having my mind completely blown when I first saw the research, not only does walking in the woods have beneficial effects on things like blood pressure and weight and diabetes, etc., but actually has a beneficial effect on the cells that exist in our bodies that fight cancer. Sleep. Now, there is quite a detailed sleep protocol that has been put into the app. So it's again a little bit too detailed to go into tonight. But sleep is incredibly important, and I'll often say slightly flippantly that it's no coincidence that sleep deprivation has been used as a means of torture for hundreds of years. If we don't sleep, our hormones go all over the place. Cortisol levels in particular just rocket, and we're in trouble. So this is a very brief summary, and there has been some absolutely amazing research that's been done over the last sort of decade, just demonstrating that actually getting a little bit of early morning sun into the back of our eyes does some really powerful things to the sleep hormones that are critically important for how well we sleep later in the day. So what happens first thing in the morning, if we do it right, it sets up beneficial reactions last thing at night. If you can avoid caffeine, I've got to say I find this really difficult. If you can avoid caffeine for the first hour or so, and then I'll suggest magnesium and vitamin D if you can. Everybody probably should be, almost everybody should be on vitamin D and a magnesium supplement to help with sleep. Actually, menopausal women find magnesium incredibly useful for things like sweats and flushes. So it's a very, very useful thing. Social connections is really just a flash way of saying spending time with friends and family. If that's not possible, then maybe think about a pet. There is actual research that suggests that people who have pets live longer and healthier. Just coming on to the final couple of slides now. So this is the introduction to the app and the coaches. We are extraordinarily lucky that all of our modality patients, all 455,000, have entirely free access to a health and well-being app. So over the course of the next few days, you will receive a link to the app. And if you follow the instructions, and there's sort of screenshots taken on this slide, just sort of showing the onboarding process. Probably the most important one is actually this one here. You sort of put your mobile phone number into it minus the 0. But you'll get some instructions on how to do that. So this will then enable you to access the app. And that is actually incredibly important because, as I've already said, the summary of tonight's session plus a lot more information, including detailed stuff on sleep, on exercise, on nutrition, is all uploaded into the app. So that's almost sort of essential. Health and wellbeing coaches are, they've been around for forever, but just not really in the NHS. We've never really, the NHS has never really focused on them until now. They are people who are trained, who are experts in the kind of stuff that's mentioned in the previous slides: lifestyle changes, nutrition, stress, helping with sleep, all of those sorts of things. And so they are absolutely available to you and will be beneficial for those that need them. Some of you at this point in time may think you don't have the need for them, and that's perfectly okay. I often say that pretty much all of us will have a bump in the road at some point, and we have a bump in the road coming very soon on the 25th of December. Christmas isn't a sort of necessarily all that great a time for some people, and certainly from a dietary perspective, it's a bit of a disaster. And so when we've done these kind of programs previously, patients have sometimes reported back to us in January that actually having the coach on tap, as it were, over a Christmas period and the sort of festive period was kind of useful, because the coaches were able to just give a little bit of extra motivation, just a bit of a check on the sort of the excesses of the festive period. So if you don't need the coach now, that's perfectly okay, but don't exclude them altogether. And they will be able to help you with sort of questions that you might have about, can I eat this, can I eat that, these sorts of things. Now, this is not specific to this program. This is a slide just basically detailing information that's already on the Modality Partnership app. The more sort of generic stuff about heating over the course of the winter, vaccinations, etc., etc. So this is on the Modality Partnership website, and for the couple of practices that have different websites, this is already linked to as well. And really, sort of final couple of slides. So lifestyle changes are incredibly powerful, and people that sort of successfully undertake them do find them to be transformative. And what usually happens is blood pressure drops, diabetes control improves, weight is often lost. And all of those things most people would say are incredibly good things. But they can need a little bit of careful monitoring when it comes to medication, particularly those diabetics who are on insulin. You will absolutely need to monitor your blood glucose very, very carefully, because your insulin requirements are likely to decrease, and your insulin levels, you need to monitor that quite carefully. If you're the sort of person that doesn't always have your yearly long-term condition review, your hypertension review, your diabetes review, whatever it might be, please don't miss your next one, whether it's, in what remains of this year or next year, because it's quite likely that your medication will need to be tweaked, either your diabetic or your hypertension medication. And actually, quite likely, when you go along and you say, well, I've got an HbA1c of 50 when last year it was 60, and I've lost 8 kilos, you're quite likely to get a pat on the back. So that'll be quite nice anyway. If you do have any symptoms that you're uncomfortable with, particularly things like lightheadedness or dizziness, that may be an indication that your medication just needs changing sooner rather than your next routine review. Just contact us and we can help that pretty straightforwardly. And then, of course, the sort of final point is that what we're trying to do is to keep you well this winter and every winter, so that you don't need this fella's services. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is me done. I will stop sharing my slide, and we're now going to have any questions. I feel like I should probably say, given that this is on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. But that's maybe going a little bit too far. Anyway, over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Dr. Bhardwaj. So yes, obviously there was a lot of information in Dr. Bhardwaj's slides there. And just while we wait for a few questions to come in, one of the things I wanted to ask, personally from a selfish point of view, Dr. Bhardwaj, is in terms of my diet, I obviously when I think of breakfast foods, I think a lot of foods that now, after your slides, I think are quite carb heavy. Do you have any sort of good suggestions for lower carb versions of sort of breakfast meals? Just while we're waiting for some more questions.
Breakfast is often the one that people kind of struggle with, and my answer is the first part is often a little bit flippant, which is that anybody who's familiar with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Roald Dahl's book, may remember Willy Wonka describing breakfast cereal as nothing better than pencil shavings, and that may seem a bit harsh, but interestingly, breakfast cereals are often the package will say fortified with, and then you'll have a whole list of vitamins and things. Fortified means that they've been added, because actually they weren't present in the cereal anyway. So they had to be added, all of those, B12s and folates and B6s and thiamines and all these sorts of things that you see on all that sort of stuff. So breakfast cereal actually not a particularly great sort of start to the day. So there's various answers to that. There are plenty of people who don't actually like breakfast anyway. It's a busy time of the day. There's lots to do. There might be kids to get ready and all of that sort of stuff. And we have said over God knows how long, breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper. Complete nonsense. There's no merit to that whatsoever. So if you're the kind of person that's almost been shamed into having breakfast, don't be. If you don't want breakfast, absolutely fine. You can have a cup of tea and just get on with it. If breakfast is important for whatever reason, maybe it's a sort of a manual job, then there are many options, and a sort of a simplistic one is if you're somebody that likes eggs and you're okay to be sort of organized a bit, then something like a frittata. So many people are aware, through holidays in Europe, there is this thing called a frittata or a tortilla, depending on what it's basically a glorified omelette with some extra stuff in it, and it can be eaten cold. So you might, for instance, make it on a Sunday, and you might make it big enough that you've got it for Monday and Tuesday potentially, and you just have a slice of that. It's eaten cold, typically on the continent. And so there is your bit of breakfast. If you want something warm, then scrambled eggs or something like that. The other thing for those that like yogurt is a sort of a Greek yogurt kind of based breakfast. So it doesn't need to be low fat. In fact, having a bit of fat, 10% Greek yogurt is a good thing to have. And what you can do then is to either have it just like that, or you can maybe put in a little bit of sweetener, maybe a tiny few drops of lemon juice, lime juice, to just give it an extra bit of taste. If you want to go a step further, is to use berries. And so frozen berries, because obviously it's now winter, and we try not to have stuff flown in from God knows where, but actually frozen berries are a really good way to have the kind of the nice sort of taste of berries. So frozen berries, just cooked slightly, just sort of simmered for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a bit of sweetener in there if you like things like allspice, and then again you can just cool it down and you can add it to some Greek yogurt, and that's often a nice way. There are plenty of recipes for sort of fake breakfast cereals out there. There's loads, and they're really good, they're tasty, but they can be a little pricey because they're reliant on nuts, and nuts are not the cheapest things in the world. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, lovely. So we've got some questions in. So obviously, Dr. Ratcliffe, also feel free to tap in if you feel like any are particularly for you. Firstly, we've got a thank you from Delia, who says, "Thank you. You've helped a great deal this evening." And then we've got a question from Elaine Hutchinson. What about intermittent fasting? Will that help if you're diabetic? What about if you're keto? What about doing a keto diet?
Do you want me to take that, Tom?
Yeah, I think this is Dr. Bhardwaj's area of expertise in particular. So I think this would be a good one for you.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. So this is Elaine. Fine. Intermittent fasting, absolutely brilliant. I just, for sort of full disclosure, I myself have actually been eating this way since about 2014, 2015, and so this is very much. I'm not the kind of person that says do as I say, or whatever it is that they say. So intermittent fasting, I eat once a day. That's it. Okay, just once a day. I don't have breakfast. I haven't got time. Usually too busy at work to have lunch. So one meal in the evening. Intermittent fasting does exactly what we want it to do, is keep those insulin levels nice and low. Now, a ketogenic diet, or keto diet is an abbreviation for a ketogenic diet, that is taking this to a slightly further than we can sort of individualize for. Depending, Elaine, where you are a patient, you may or may not have GPs in your practice who are completely familiar with the ketogenic diet. So that's taking this. So I talked very, very sort of in general terms about 100 to 120 grams of carbohydrates. The ketogenic diet, depending on other factors, so like how old you are, what kind of exercise you do, might be around about 50 grams. If you're on medication, particularly for diabetes, those medications will need to be stopped for a ketogenic diet, except for metformin. Everything else will need to be stopped, and that's actually that's a little bit more involved. And so, if you really want to do that, then okay. But that's actually a little bit more involved than this program can really help you with. But yeah, hopefully. But intermittent fasting, absolutely, go for it.
Perfect. So we have a couple more thank yous. Neil says, thank you, I've started on this route already. And Barbara has also said, thank you, I found this very informative, especially interesting to see the graphs to back up the reasoning behind the advice. Seems like we have a graph fan in the room. So another question, how does celiac disease complicate all this? Now, obviously, this is going to be quite specific to patients who are suffering with celiacs, but if we can touch briefly on it, that'd be brilliant.
Actually, this kind of approach is an approach that I actually recommend for patients with celiac disease. So for those who are unfamiliar, celiac disease is an intolerance for something called gluten, which is often, which is basically found in wheat type products. So a diet which is low in carbohydrates, particularly low in sort of things like wheat and grains, usually benefits very much from this type of approach. A lot of celiacs are signposted to a diet called a low FODMAP diet, FODMAP. But this actually takes it a little bit further. So I would be reasonably optimistic, Ted, that actually your celiac disease, if indeed you have celiac disease, that would actually improve from this approach as well.
Yeah, because obviously when we're talking about grains, we're talking about sort of pastas and breads, aren't we? Anything with wheat in it, and trying to stick with the other carbs, sort of things like rice and things like that, which is better,
Correct.
isn't it?
And actually, Josh, you just reminded me on that celiac patients are often sort of forced, quote unquote, to buy sort of gluten replacement products, so sort of gluten-free bread and pasta and biscuits and noodles, and those are often very expensive and they're often exceedingly processed. And the guidance that I give my own patients is just don't have them. They're just processed, they're expensive, you don't need them, just try and do without.
Yeah, we have a question from Alan who actually put a question quite early in the stream, and I wasn't quite sure. He mentioned if he has high blood pressure and it's being treated and controlled with medication, would you still recommend obviously the things that we've discussed today? Because obviously there's a part of it where if your blood pressure is under control, is there a need to make these changes?
Well, yes. I mean, I think as Dr. Bhardwaj alluded to in his presentation, if you manage to reduce your blood pressure through lifestyle changes, that's going to benefit you in terms of reducing your blood pressure, but it's going to have all sorts of other benefits as well in terms of tackling the other aspects of the metabolic syndrome. And, so it will improve your blood fats. It will reduce your chances of other conditions. Increasing your level of exercise is known to reduce your risk of developing cancer, the risk of developing dementia. So it has all sorts of other benefits. And certainly both myself and Dr. Bhardwaj have seen a lot of patients who've managed to make lifestyle changes, and by doing so, go from sometimes having quite severe high blood pressure to normal blood pressure without tablets. So if you're already taking tablets, then we would recommend this approach as well. But obviously, as you do so, you just need to keep an eye on your blood pressure, because if you successfully change your lifestyle, your blood pressure will come down. So you need to keep an eye on that, and that might give you the opportunity to stop some of your blood pressure medications, and release you from some of the side effects that a lot of people experience with medication. And then obviously, as you're making these changes, if you notice symptoms of low blood pressure, such as being lightheaded or feeling dizzy, then obviously you need to talk your medication through with a clinician at your practice sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Yeah, who doesn't want to take less tablets? Obviously, it would be much better to get off as many tablets as we can. So I've got a question from Anne. She struggles with having sometimes high and sometimes low blood pressure, as well as POTS, the hypermobile type. She's slightly underweight. How would you recommend her? Obviously, this is slightly different to sort of our other end of approach where we're normally trying to get weight down. How would you sort of tackle that?
I think it's still very relevant, and it's interesting about the high and low blood pressure, because that may well be related to those sort of hormonal peaks and troughs often related to sort of glucose levels as a result of, this kind of the diet. So one of the things that I'll often sort of find with patients is them sort of reporting back that they just feel as though their sort of energy levels are more stable. And that's not by accident. That's because the hormones themselves are not doing the sort of crazy up and down thing. The sort of the up and down is much, much narrower. And that will almost certainly affect the high and low blood pressure as well. Now, being slightly underweight is not disastrous at all. I mean, this approach works brilliantly for those who are overweight. Being slightly underweight merely means that actually you're allowed, in a sense, you're allowed to eat more. It's perfectly fine as long as you enjoy food. Then you can just eat a little bit more, and what you eat will sort of depend upon your own preferences. If you're somebody that really, so there's a question there which I don't know who's put it, but it says, "What's your favorite low carb recipe?" And that's actually an incredibly difficult question. I'm assuming that's a question for me and not maybe for the sort of the patients. But I'm bringing that in because actually one of the things that I find incredibly useful is tuna mayonnaise. So if you're somebody that is happy to eat fish, you're not a vegan, for instance, then actually just having a bit of tuna mayonnaise sort of on standby can be incredibly useful. It's a good source of protein, provided the mayonnaise isn't the really nasty stuff that's full of all sorts of rubbish. Then actually that's a very good source of fat soluble vitamins, etc. And so for somebody who is maybe a little bit underweight, then a combination of this approach and a slightly higher level of protein, something like tuna mayonnaise, for instance, can be incredibly helpful for all kinds of sort of beneficial health impacts.
Perfect. I was going to say some of the other things you can do that are really good low carb options is there are some vegetables which you can grate and turn them into sort of alternatives for rice, which I always think is really interesting. If you just put a cauliflower or a broccoli through a grater, it turns into quite a nice alternative to rice, which I think is quite tasty sometimes. We have a question, and I apologize to the person because I'll probably butcher your name, but Mayose Suleimane Diagni, who's asked, what's the best exercise for stress? And I wondered if at this point we could also have a bit of a discussion about potentially exercising for people who struggle a bit more with exercising in terms of maybe they have limited movement or problems with potentially getting out. Maybe they're waiting for hip replacements, knee replacements, because obviously we know the waiting lists are there. So I wondered if anybody could take that.
So so in terms of exercise and stress, so we evolved in a very different time in history to the one that we're living in now. So in the past, when we were stressed, it was obviously in response to a physical threat. We might have been stuck in a wilderness somewhere or faced with a wild animal. So the stress hormones get us ready to respond to that by raising our sugar levels so that we're ready to escape from a situation, raising our blood pressure so that we're our organs getting all the fuel, all the blood quickly they need to escape from a situation. But of course, modern life's not like that. And the reason we're stressed in modern life is because of work, because we're worrying about money or the cost of living, because we're feeling lonely. And so having constantly high levels of these stress hormones is really bad for us. And exercise, there's really good evidence that the exercise helps reduce the levels of stress hormones. It helps bring down our insulin levels because it makes our cells more efficient. So all exercise is good for stress. And Dr. Bhardwaj can talk through a program that he's worked on for people to come back to Josh's question, to help people who are perhaps not able to head straight out in their running gear and run 5 or 10 kilometers.
Yeah, although actually describing it without sort of either doing it or showing photographs is kind of difficult. I think probably the best thing maybe is to say that it's kind of straightforward. It's all sort of body weight stuff. So as I said, walking, if you can get out and walk. We had somebody on the session that we did on Tuesday who was sort of struggling with sort of knee pain, and we mentioned things like exercise bikes. And those sorts of things. Now, again, the key thing is not to go too full on. There's a sweet spot, not too slow, not too fast, just a nice level there. To the 3 to 5 program doesn't involve weights. It doesn't involve sort of dumbbells or anything like that. It's just body weight. So it's very, very straightforward. It doesn't involve anything too heavy, and a push, a pull, and a squat type exercise. A push may be something like a press up, but many people can't do a press up on the floor. That's okay. You can put your hands up on a wall at sort of shoulder height, and you can do a press up like that. A lot of the weight is just taken away from you. And as you get better, the hands can come further down and you're putting more weight on. So that's a very straightforward sort of push. Kind of hard to describe a pull, but it involves a sort of a doorway. Most people can't do a pull up. But it's a sort of a horizontal pull. And a squat, in a way, when you go and sit down into a chair, that is actually a squat. That's half a squat. So imagine sort of sitting down into a chair, but not actually putting all of your weight down. And as soon as your bottom sort of touches the chair, you kind of push back up again. And if you do those are very, very sort of simple, basic. They're often called primal movements because they're things that we will have been doing, for 2 million years, as long as humans have been around.
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, isn't it? It's that sort of small, and anything that you can manage is always better than nothing. And I think that's a good approach to everything in terms of diet, exercise, lifestyle in general. Half of the battle is just starting doing it, and then it's obviously slowly increasing what you're able to do. Sort of in response to that, Janet has said, I suffer from high blood pressure and I am on 2 tablets to keep it low currently. Do you think I'd be able to get it down without tablets? And I think that's exactly what the presentation today is all about, isn't it? It's all about those sort of changes you can make to get your weight down, to improve your cardiovascular health, and hopefully bring that blood pressure down to the point where you can potentially stop your tablets. Obviously, as both Dr. Ratcliffe and Dr. Bhardwaj have said, if that happens, it's important to get in contact with the surgery and speak to a clinician about potentially side effects that you're having, or potentially if you start noticing some symptoms of sort of low blood pressure, to definitely get in contact and potentially get some advice on which medications to stop first and how to stop them safely. Another question we have from Sharon. Can you say a bit more about the program and the coaches? So I'm presuming that's about the Goki health coaches. Is there anywhere that you can sort of advise people to go to get a bit more information about that, Dr. Bhardwaj? Well, I mean, we do have a website. There is a Goki UK website for anybody that's interested. So just a sort of a broad brush about the program and the coaches. The way that we've sort of designed this is this sort of session hopefully sets the scene. What we've established over a few years is that just referring people for coaching alone, I think we in the UK, we're not familiar with coaches. If we were to send out a text and say, oh, here's some coaches, most patients will not engage. So this is an introductory session. Hopefully gives a little bit of a flavor for it. As I said at the start, hopefully informative, and maybe even slightly inspirational. Then the coaches are able to do what I sometimes call healthcare hand-holding. So it's just being able, you maybe you wake up, one morning and you're just not feeling like you're firing on all cylinders. You can send, for instance, your coach a text and say, look, I'm not feeling that great. I'm really tempted to have a slice of, fruit cake or whatever it might be. And the coach might just, maybe later in the day,
just give you a little bit of sort of guidance and support and motivation. And they're real coaches. I mean, there are programs that are out there, and I won't name them, and they are, you know, sort of AI coaches, but these are real people.
Perfect. And I'm just conscious of time. We are coming to the end of the stream. So just before we sort of do the last comments, I'm just going to say thank you very much to Dr. Bhardwaj. Thank you very much to Dr. Ratcliffe. And also thank you to everyone who's joined us on YouTube or on Facebook, and everyone who's been asking questions. I'm really glad to hear that we've inspired you, Delia. Get out there and get walking. And that sort of applies to everyone out there. I hope everyone has found it really informative. And as we've sort of echoed throughout this entire thing, it's not hard. It's not hard, the activities that we need to do to sort of keep our cardiovascular health as good as possible. What it is it's just about making small changes that make big differences. And I think that's what we can all agree on, is small changes make big differences in sort of improving that cardiovascular health. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll hopefully see you again sometime. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.